Um, I'll pose the same question to Mohammed Rashdan in terms of your views on the NETR and also how the energy exchange fits into this ambitious goal.
Sure, thank you, Chehan. I'll be very brief as YB Minister has already outlined the aims and visions of NETR, why we need it. Obviously, it's an economic imperative and so on. But I'll touch on the energy exchange element. So YB Minister mentioned about the necessity of grid investment. Let's call it the green grid of the future. And why does it have to be 180 over so billion? So, you know, if you're wondering, the grid already, the regulatory asset base is about 70 billion. That's something that the Energy Commission presides over and regulates. Of course, the owner is Tenaga. Now, that grid is perhaps one of the best in the world. It is a very, very strong grid. Together with the ministry, single buyer, we have come up with a grid code that ensures the stability of the system, and it has been built over decades. Now, renewable energy basically presents a tremendous challenge because of its intermittency. So a solar panel can really produce energy for about 4 hours in a day, or that's really peak power. The rest of the time, its power generation is less than its potential because of the sun is not shining too brightly, but in Malaysia mainly is because of clouds. The problem with clouds is they can come at any time. As you all know, rain today on the way here and so on and so forth. So when that happens, especially when we have tremendous amount of solar energy generation, the dip in power to the grid would cause massive blackouts everywhere unless you strengthen the grid. So that investment that YB mentioned is to strengthen that grid to accept huge degrees of intermittency. Now, where does the energy exchange comes into all this is because at 180 billion, that is 2.5 times the current regulatory asset base. Now, who's going to pay for that? So that's an additional investment over and above the current RAB to even achieve the net plan. So simply put, if we don't invest it, then we can't have solar plant up because the grid can't take it, essentially. So we need to look at essentially sources of finance, and I know this room is full of them, but we need to have an energy exchange to allow a market clearing price to have the right level of economics, not just to pay for energy generation, but also to pay for energy delivery. So that delivery includes the grid component. And one of the very important objectives of the current administration is to have a just, equitable, and inclusive transition. So the term equitable and just would obviously mean that we cannot burden the consumer, i.e. the rakyat, too much with the huge cost. So we need to find ways on how to do this through the energy exchange. And of course, I think YB already mentioned, through exports, if we find the right clearing price, then the so-called premium is embedded in the market price of an energy export will also help to pay the development of the grid.
Actually, you made a very interesting point in that a lot of people, including you, touched a bit on the merits and demerits of the energy exchange. But if you can give us a little more color on how each stakeholder would be impacted and any sense of, you know, how some of this can be managed from a, I guess, socio-economic standpoint as well as a commercial perspective.
Yeah, so you mentioned merits and demerits. Yeah, I suppose it depends on from which lens you're looking at as a stakeholder. We, together with NRCC, see obviously much more merits than demerits. of having an energy exchange. But perhaps let's look at it from the export standpoint of that particular stakeholder. So if you look at the load centers or companies that require renewable energy, particularly RE100 companies in Singapore, they are paying a very, very high price. My understanding is green energy in Singapore is trading and this is what's called an off-market trade, because all electrons go through what's called their wholesale market. But after it goes through the wholesale market, where everything is pooled, pure green energy is trading at even a higher price. And depending on 1 or 2 year contracts, 1 year I think is trading at about 45 cents. Given current exchange rates, that's almost 1 ringgit 50 cent. As you can see, that's significantly higher, that's per kilowatt hour. So the merits, of course, is if we can tap that, then clearly that economic can pay not just for generation, but that delivery that I mentioned, that whole system. And that would create a tremendous amount of excitement for solar plant up or any other renewable energy plant up, not just solar, that suddenly biomass and biogas becomes also basically commercially viable. Now it's not. If you look at Malaysian prices for biomass, biogas, a lot of the stakeholders, especially plantation companies, will go, it's too much hassle, the investment I need to put, the prices are not. But if you're talking about those level of prices, okay, maybe plantation companies will, or plantations will become renewable energy sites and not sell palm oil anymore. But this is just an example. Of course, the commercial players will make up their own minds, but at the right pricing, a lot can happen. So that's where we see a significant amount of upside. And this can be done commercially and hopefully without the need for government assistance or subsidy. That's the other element. As you know, in Singapore, the energy market has no subsidy at all. And they have done this for decades. So it's a true market function. We are still a ways away from that. But if we can tap that, then will be to our benefit.
If I could just ask a follow-up question here. You mentioned the significant investment needed for a complete upgrade of the distribution and transmission. But initially, from what you see from the Energy Commission standpoint, say to get some level of exports up and running to Singapore, how easily or not can that be initiated and implemented? Because this is a step process anyway. So how far are we from kind of implementing something like that?
Okay, sure. There is an existing interconnect already to Singapore as part of NRCC's LTMS scheme, which has been very successful. LTMS stands for Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. And it's a collaboration between these countries where we allow access to our grid, where they can export their energy from, say, Laos, all the way down to Singapore. There is some spare capacity there, several hundred megawatt only left, 200 to 300. So really we need to build new interconnects, but yes, we can start it very soon. At least 200 megawatt is physically possible. But then we need to have the framework, which is what YB Minister and the Cabinet are focused on, where essentially electrons from anywhere in Malaysia can find its way to Singapore. However, there is a big however, we also need to ensure that Malaysia's own needs for renewable energy is also addressed. That is also a function of the energy exchange. So we don't want accusations, especially this was one of the objections from the past, that they say, apart from the Johor water issue, they will say, if we export to Singapore, that means there's 1 electron less for Malaysians. So to ensure that doesn't happen, again, the energy exchange, that's why it's a clearing mechanism, to say once Malaysia's needs are met, obviously there's a surplus. The surplus can go to other countries, not limited to Singapore, Thailand as well, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so on a kind of separate topic for Rashdan, with all these changes potentially happening, what are some of the regulatory challenges that you envisage? Energy exchange, market aggregator, starting to export, preserving your home market. How would the whole regulatory framework have to change and fit in, and the challenges?
Sure. Thank you, Jehan. I think one of the main issues we have at the Commission is that whilst our system has served us very well, as YB mentioned, I myself said we have one of the best grids in the world. Our CIMB score, and that's how we rate ourselves, is one of the lowest, certainly on par with many developed nations. Having said that, our market or energy market is unfortunately several decades behind. And this is because, for YB Nick is almost a multi-generational baton. The father is passing it to the son now, and so on. It's taken that long. But essentially, this is it's quite a challenge given the current landscape that we are in. So the energy exchange purports to address some of it, but clearly not all of it. And our current laws as well doesn't really have provisions on effectively market trading. It doesn't. So obviously there needs to be acts has to change as well. Now that would take a long time to do. The EECA, which was just passed, thank you very much, and the cabinet, took, I don't know, 6-7 years, I think, in terms of its inception to passing. Very long time. Now we can't wait another 7 years. Or clearly, we need to do it right now. So therefore, I think there needs to be issuance of a lot of regulatory principles and guidelines. First, coming from the cabinet, coming from the ministry, obviously, then down to us, the regulator, where we then will issue more detailed guidelines. But the other challenge I feel is then education of the marketplace, because they also need to understand what is the right, I suppose, level of price. We are very used to, and the budget was just announced by the Prime Minister very recently. We are very used to subsidies in all elements of our lives. And the subsidy for energy, including petrol, but also there's gas, and so on and so forth, and other levels of subsidies, even within the tariff structure, is very pervasive. So again, if we want to have so it's almost, how should I say it, contradictory when you have a market clearing mechanism which includes tremendous amount of subsidy elements. That also doesn't jive very well. So this is an attempt to how can we, especially if you want to export, in those countries, there's no subsidy. So we need to have really an education process at the marketplace. This probably has to be gradual to then accept what are the right levels of market clearing within that energy exchange, and then to regulate that accordingly.
And I guess the one last question to Rashdan on the tariff structure. How, any sense of how this would evolve? Because you'll have different buyers, different players, and you also need to, as you all both rightfully said, protect those households that really need some sort of tariff assistance and so on. So has there been any sort of evaluations done at the moment, and any guidance you can give us?
Okay. So what you just touched on is tariff reform. And in Malaysia, you see the predominant amount of energy that is supplied to, say, households, SMEs, and so on. So you're looking at a statistic called the energy mix, not to be confused with the capacity mix. So the capacity mix, we have a pretty high renewable energy element within our capacity mix, somewhere around the region of mid-20s in terms of percentage. But if you translate that to energy mix, in Peninsula, it's probably around only 6 to 7%. So the brown energy, by the way, the reason for that is, of course, the sun doesn't shine the whole time. I already touched that. So that's why there's a difference between capacity mix, which is often quoted, but energy mix, which is not often quoted, is only 6 to 7%. So let's put that in perspective. So that means 93% at least is still with brown energy. Now the energy exchange is not going to touch the brown energy, and so predominantly more than 90% of all your requirements is produced by actually coal. Coal is the largest producer of energy, and for quite some time this will continue because we had only just put up those plants. So they will continue for some time according to the PPAs. And then, of course, there's gas. But these two energy sources are, of course, highly reliable. Now, within that, there is then, I already mentioned the whole element of subsidies and so on through domestic and whatnot. So the tariff reform, basically, it's I would say it's a bit too ambitious if to do it all together with the green. We're focusing on the green energy first. Let's get that right. Let's try to get the so-called market clearing prices through energy exchange done right first. Let's try to remove subsidies there. But trying to remove subsidies from a 93% element of the tariff, that requires a heck of a lot more work. So we are looking into it together with the ministry especially. That will be maybe a few years from now. But as opposed to, so the energy exchange fee is looking at green, and therefore tariff reform will not be a part of it just yet. But perhaps targeted subsidies is again something that the ministry is also looking to and already has launched as far as what I call the T1 or T2%, those who have very, very large bills. We obviously want to really, YB's vision is really to really support solar especially. Solar is technically free. There's this big nuclear fusion furnace in the sky, courtesy of God Almighty. Now, the solar, I see a few solar players here. Solar generation has come to a point that it has become commercially viable, perhaps thanks to China, because of the price of solar photovoltaics, even battery technologies, they keep driving it down and down and down through economies of scale. So over time, the need for subsidy for solar is come to a point where you don't need subsidy anymore. At generation level is actually cheaper than brown energy to produce solar. The problem is the intermittency. That's the problem. And then the delivery. So what we are looking at is how to have a holistic delivery system, not just generation. Then you get the Vietnam problem. We can't have the Vietnam problem, obviously. So we need to have it done holistically, working together with the ministry, single buyer, Tenaga, and so on, to address the whole equation from source to load center and across the country as well. So that is actually the challenge also with the tariff reform. How do we get the tariff to accommodate the investment requirement to deliver that? And if we don't, then we cannot accept the solar either. So we want, obviously, everyone to have the benefit of renewable energy.
And I think subsidizing solar is just going backwards.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense. Okay, in the sense of time, we would like to open the floor for a few questions. And I thank both panelists for agreeing to take questions from the floor as well. So if we can have about 4 or 5 questions, I think we have time. I'm getting pushed from that side a little bit, but given how important this